The silent path to inner peace. John had never heard silence quite like this before. Sitting on his porch, rocking gently back and forth, he listened, not to the chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves, but to the deafening absence of sound. It pressed against his ears, thick and suffocating like an invisible weight. For nearly 70 years his life had been filled with noise, the constant ringing of phones, the sharp voices in meetings, the hum of city traffic outside his office window. Even at home there had always been something, the TV murmuring in the background, his children laughing, his wife calling out from the kitchen. But now there was nothing. His wife had passed 5 years ago. His children had moved out long before that, and retirement, which once seemed like a golden reward, now stretched before him like a vast and empty ocean. No meetings, no deadlines, no urgent emails demanding his attention, just silence. At first, he had welcomed it. After decades of stress, the idea of peace had seemed like a gift, but he soon realized that silence was not the same as peace. It was eerie, unfamiliar. It made him restless, uneasy, and worst of all, it made him think. Without the distractions of work and routine, memories began surfacing. Old regrets, things left unsaid, moments lost forever. The mistakes, the missed opportunities, the words he wished he could take back. In the noise of life, he had been too busy to hear them. But now in the stillness they were deafening. He tried to escape it. He turned the TV on, but the chatter of strangers didn't fill the void. He played music, but the melodies felt hollow. He called old colleagues, but the conversations were short, awkward, reminders of a past he no longer belonged to. One evening, in frustration, he shouted at the empty house, "Why is it so damn quiet?" Of course, no one answered. John had spent his whole life chasing success, believing that happiness was something to be achieved, built, acquired. But now, standing in the ruins of a once busy life, he realized he had never truly learned how to just be. He had mastered the art of speaking, of managing, of controlling, but never the art of listening. Not to others, not to himself. Had he been afraid of silence all along? That night, unable to sleep, he found himself staring at an old photograph of his wife. He remembered how she used to sit quietly in the mornings, sipping tea, gazing out the window as if the world itself was whispering secrets only she could hear. What did you hear in the silence, he wondered. He needed to find out. And so the next morning he made a decision. For the first time in his life, he would stop running from the quiet. Instead, he would step into it. He would listen, not to the noise of the past, not to the regrets in his mind, but to something deeper, something that had been waiting for him all along. But what would he find there? Was there peace in silence? Or was there something even more terrifying? As he took his first steps into the unknown, he had no idea that silence would change his life forever. The weight of noise, the sound of crunching leaves beneath John's feet echoed through the empty yard. Each step sent a dry, brittle rustle into the autumn air, the crisp remains of summer breaking apart under his weight. He paused for a moment, looking down at the scattered leaves, and a thought struck him. This is what my mind feels like. Every leaf, every fragment of gold and brown was like a thought, restless, never-ending, drifting through his mind without control. There was a time when John had thrived in noise. His days had been a constant barrage of phone calls, meetings, and deadlines. The ring of his office phone was like a starting gun, launching him into action from the moment he stepped into the building. Conversations overlapped, emails poured in, and his calendar was a battlefield of appointments, reminders, and urgent tasks. He had once joked that silence was a luxury he couldn't afford, and then one day the noise stopped. Retirement had arrived like an unexpected guest. He had spent so many years thinking about it, dreaming of lazy mornings, afternoon walks, and evenings free of stress. But when the day finally came, it was nothing like he imagined. The silence was not peaceful. It was vast, unfamiliar, suffocating. Aranatiya. First, he kept himself busy. He filled his days with errands, small home projects, and mindless distractions. The television became his background noise, a constant hum to mask the emptiness of the house. He scrolled through his phone, reading, articles he didn't care about, checking messages from people who rarely responded. He called old co-workers trying to keep a foot in the world he once knew, but the conversations felt forced, like talking to ghosts of a past life. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outrun the silence. One morning, as he sat at the breakfast table staring at his untouched coffee, he noticed something peculiar. The house had its own way of breathing. The creak of the floorboards, the distant ticking of a clock, the rustling of leaves outside the window. These were sounds he had never noticed before, buried beneath the years of conference calls and city traffic. Now, they were all that remained. He began to realize that the noise he had once resented had actually been a shield. It had protected him from something far more unsettling, the weight of his own thoughts. With nothing to distract him, his mind became a restless storm. Regrets he had buried for decades resurfaced, like waves crashing against a shore. The missed birthdays, the unspoken apologies, the moments when he had chosen work over family. He replayed old conversations, dissecting every word, wishing he could go back and say something different. Do something different. The past was loud in the silence. One evening, unable to sit still, he wandered outside. The autumn wind tugged at his sweater as he paced along the edge of his yard. The leaves beneath his feet whispered with every step. Rustle. Why didn't you take that trip with her when you had the chance? Crunch, you should have been there more for your kids. Snap. You worked so hard for what? He stopped, staring at the dim glow of his neighbor's window. Someone was laughing inside. A warm, easy sound that felt like a foreign language to him now. Had he ever known how to enjoy simple moments like that? Or had he been too busy moving from one task to the next, mistaking motion for meaning? He looked. Down at the leaves again, scattered and restless, constantly shifting with the wind. They had nowhere to go, no purpose other than to be blown from place to place. Just like his thoughts. Just like his life had been. For the first time, John wondered, had he ever truly been present? Not just physically, but fully, mind, body, and soul. Had he ever truly sat with a moment, embraced it, let it exist without rushing forward to the next thing? A deep breath filled his lungs. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of earth and the distant smoke of burning firewood. For so long, he had feared silence. But maybe silence wasn't the enemy. Maybe it was an invitation to listen, to observe, to finally understand. As he turned back toward the house, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would stop running from the quiet. He would step into it, embrace it, and see what lay beyond the noise. Maybe, just maybe, there was something waiting for him there. The first steps into silence. John woke up that morning with a plan. No talking, not a single word. It seemed easy enough. After all, he lived alone. Who was there to talk to anyway? But this wasn't just about avoiding conversation. It was about stepping into silence fully, without distraction, without escape. For one whole day, he would resist the urge to fill the emptiness with meaningless noise. He made his coffee in silence. The gentle drip of the machine, the bubbling of hot water. He had never noticed how rhythmic, how almost meditative those sounds were. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around his mug, watching the steam curl into the air. Normally, this was when he would reach for his phone, scroll through the news, check emails he no longer needed to answer. But today there was only the quiet, and in that quiet his mind began to stir. At first it was small, little thoughts floating up like leaves on the surface of a pond. Did I remember to take out the trash? I should clean out the garage. Maybe I'll go for a walk later. Then the deeper waves came. The things he had pushed down, ignored, buried under years of work and obligation. The voices of the past, the ones he thought had faded, returned with startling clarity. His father's stern lectures, his wife's laughter, the distant fading memory of his son as a boy, tugging at his sleeve, saying, "Dad, look at this." And John, too distracted, waving him off with a distracted, "Not now." Now was all he had. He closed his eyes, but the silence only seemed to grow louder. Regret rose in his chest like a tide, swelling with every passing second. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sudden noise jolting. Him from his thoughts. He needed to get out of the house. The air outside was crisp and cool, the sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of morning clouds. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, hands in his pockets, the world around him strangely vivid without the usual distractions, the distant hum of cars, the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps, the way the wind rattled through the trees. It was almost beautiful, yet inside his mind was anything but still. Like an ocean after a storm, his thoughts crashed in relentless waves, memories, worries, regrets, tumbling over each other, pulling him under. The more he tried to silence them, the louder they became. What am I doing? He thought. Is this what silence is? A flood of everything I've been avoiding? By the afternoon, the weight of it all had become unbearable. He needed a change of scenery, a way to clear his head. That was how he found himself, at the Buddhist temple. He had driven past it countless times over the years, but had never stopped. It was a simple structure, nothing grand or imposing. Just a quiet place tucked away behind a grove of trees, its golden roof barely visible from the road. John hesitated before stepping inside. He wasn't a religious man. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. But something pulled him forward, a quiet nudge from somewhere deep within. Inside, the temple was bathed in soft golden light. The air smelled of incense, rich and calming. A few monks moved silently through the space, their robes swaying gently with each step. John felt strangely self-conscious, as if his presence was too loud, his thoughts too chaotic for a place so still. An elderly monk approached him, his face lined with years of quiet wisdom. He nodded in greeting but said nothing. John hesitated, then whispered, I don't really know why I'm here. The monk smiled, motioned for John to follow him and led him to a small meditation hall. It was empty except for a single cushion placed at the center of the room. The monk gestured for John to sit. I don't know how to meditate, John admitted. The monk simply smiled. Just sit, breathe, listen. John obeyed. He sat. He breathed. He listened. At first, there was nothing but the usual noise in his head, the same restless waves of thought, the same regrets, the same old voices. But then, something shifted. He became aware of his breath, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the subtle way the air entered his nose, cool and light, and left his lips warm and steady. The thoughts were still there, but he wasn't drowning in them anymore. He was simply observing, like standing on the shore, watching the waves roll, in and out. For the first time in a long, long while, John felt something close to peace. After some time, he wasn't sure how long, the monk finally spoke. There is a phrase we use, he said, noble silence. It is not just the absence of words, but the quieting of the mind. When we stop trying to escape, when we stop filling every moment with noise, we begin to hear what has always been there. John nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. Not yet. As he left the temple, he felt different. Not entirely changed, but lighter, as if something had loosened its grip on him just a little. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about what the monk had said. Maybe silence wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was something to embrace. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to listen. John sat in his living room, staring at the empty space before him. The air was thick with silence, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He had never noticed how quiet a house could be until now. For most of his life, noise had been his constant companion. The ringing of phones, the endless hum of conversations, the clatter of a busy household. Even the sounds of the city outside his office window had been a kind of comfort, a reminder that the world was always moving, always demanding. He had lived in that rhythm, thriving in the rush of meetings and deadlines, convinced that busyness was proof of purpose. And then, one day, it all stopped. Retirement had arrived, not with a sense of freedom, but with an unsettling emptiness. At first he had welcomed the change, imagining slow mornings with coffee, afternoons lost in books, evenings of quiet reflection. But the quiet was different from what he had expected. It wasn't peaceful, it was vast. It was unfamiliar. Filled the spaces where noise used to be. turning on the television just to hear voices, scrolling through news articles that didn't interest him, calling old co-workers just to feel connected to something. But conversations were brief, their words polite but distant. He was no longer part of their world, and he felt it. One evening he stepped outside, hoping the cool air might clear his mind. The autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet, their brittle whispers breaking the silence around him. He looked down and saw them scattered across the ground, restless, shifting with the wind, never still. That's what his mind felt like. Thoughts swirled endlessly, memories of a life that had passed. Too quickly, regrets that had been buried beneath years of work and responsibility. Missed birthdays, unspoken apologies, moments he wished he could live again. The past was loud in the silence, and no matter how much he tried to quiet it, it wouldn't go away. He needed to do something. Anything. The next morning, he made a decision. He would spend the day in silence, not just avoiding conversation, but stepping fully into quiet, resisting the urge to fill the emptiness with distractions. At first, it seemed easy. He made coffee without the hum of the television in the background. He sat at the table, listening to the soft drip of the machine, the distant ticking of the clock. But within minutes, his mind began to rebel. Did he take out the trash? What was he supposed to do with all this free time? Should he call his son? Would his son even answer? The thoughts came faster, each one dragging him away from the present moment. He sighed, rubbing his temples, trying to force his mind to be still. But the more he resisted, the louder it became. By midday, the silence felt unbearable. He needed to get out of the house. He found himself driving with no real destination, letting the road unfold before him. That was how he ended up at the temple. He had passed it many times before, but never thought to stop. Now, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the golden light from the windows casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. A few monks moved through the space in quiet, their robes flowing as they walked. An elderly monk approached him, offering a small nod in greeting. John hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know why I'm here." The monk only smiled and motioned for him to follow. They walked outside to the temple gardens, where the sky stretched open above them. The monk pointed upward. "Tell me, John, when you see clouds in the sky, do you try to chase them away?" John frowned. "No, of course not." "And why is that?" "Because they just pass on their own." The monk nodded. "Your thoughts are the same. You are not your thoughts. You are the sky. The clouds will always be there, but they do not define the sky. They simply drift through it." John stood in silence, watching as the wind carried the clouds across the sky. He had spent so long trying to silence his mind, to fight against the thoughts that came unbidden. But what if he didn't have to fight? What if he could simply watch them come and go? That night he tried again. He sat on the cushion in his living room, closed his eyes, and let the silence settle around him. The thoughts came, just as they always did. But this time, he didn't try to push them away. He let them be. He noticed them, acknowledged them, the regret, the memories, the worries, and then slowly he let them drift. For the first time, silence did not feel like an enemy. It felt like an open space waiting to be understood. And in that space, he found something. Unexpected, not control, not certainty, but peace. John woke up earlier than usual. The house was still bathed in the soft blue-grey light of dawn, the world outside barely stirring. He stretched his legs over the side of the bed, letting his feet rest against the cool wooden floor. There was something different about this morning, though he couldn't quite place it yet. As he made his way to the kitchen, he felt no urgency to turn on the television or fill the air with background noise. Instead, he simply poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the fading remnants of night. John settled into his chair, wrapping his hands around the warmth of his mug. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, allowing himself to simply exist in the moment, and that was when he heard it. Not silence, at least not in the way he had once feared it, but something else entirely, the chirping of birds in the Hijau distance, their melodies light and effortless. the wind weaving through the trees, rustling the leaves with a gentle murmur, the faint hum of the world waking up, stretching, settling into its rhythm. It was all so simple yet so profound. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. He wasn't lost in memories or weighed down by regrets. He was just here. It struck him how much he had missed over the years. He had spent so much of his life chasing things, achievements, recognition, responsibilities, that he had forgotten how to just be. He had measured his days by productivity, by what he had accomplished, by what he could control. But sitting here now, surrounded by the quiet symphony of morning, he realized that life had been unfolding all along, with or without him. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was full of things he had never taken the time to notice. The way the golden light of sunrise stretched across the grass, the way the breeze carried the scent of pine and earth, the way his own breath moved in and out, steady and certain, a quiet rhythm of existence. It reminded him of something the monk had said to him days before. You are not your thoughts. You are the sky. And in this moment, his mind felt like that. Sky, vast, open, undisturbed. He thought about the way a still lake could reflect the entire world upon its surface. When the water was calm, everything became clear. The trees, the sky, the passing clouds, nothing was distorted, nothing was hidden beneath ripples of disturbance. Perhaps his mind had always been like that lake, but he had spent years tossing stones into it, stirring the water, creating waves of distraction and unrest. Now for the first time he was allowing it to settle, and in its stillness he could finally see. He had always thought silence meant loneliness, that it was an absence, a void, a reminder of all that had been lost. But he had been wrong. Silence was connection to himself, to the world, to something far greater than he had ever understood before. In the distance a bird called out, its song light and effortless, as if it had no concern beyond this very moment. John let out a quiet chuckle. For years he had been so consumed by the noise of life that he had forgotten how to listen. But the truth had always been there, waiting for him in the spaces between the sound. And now, finally, he was ready to hear it. John's days began to change, though not in any grand or dramatic way. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow, patient blooming of flowers in a forgotten garden. He no longer rushed to fill every quiet moment with noise. He no longer reached for the television first thing in the morning, or scrolled through his phone just to feel connected to a world that had seemed to move on without him. Instead, he let the silence linger. And in that space, he found a new kind of presence. When his grandchildren visited, he listened more. He had always loved them, of course, but he now realized how often his mind had been elsewhere during their conversations, half engaged, nodding absent-mindedly while thinking of 100 other things. Now he gave them his full attention. He noticed the way his granddaughter's eyes lit up when she talked about her school projects, how his grandson's voice carried excitement when he described the characters in his favorite book. He no longer interrupted to offer advice they hadn't asked for. He no longer felt the need to steer the conversation or fill every silence with words. He simply listened. And something beautiful happened. His grandchildren opened up to him in ways they never had before. They lingered a little longer after dinner, shared things with him he had never thought to ask about. He had spent years believing that wisdom came from speaking, from imparting knowledge, from offering answers. But now he saw that sometimes wisdom was knowing when not to speak. His walks became different too. He had always seen walking as a means to an end, a way to get from one place to another, or something to do for the sake of exercise. Now it was something else entirely. He walked slowly, deliberately, feeling the ground beneath his feet, the steady rhythm of his steps. He noticed the shifting colors of the trees, the way the light filtered through the leaves in the late afternoon. The world was alive in a way he had never fully appreciated. The birds had always sung, the wind had always whispered through the branches, but he had never truly listened. One morning, he stopped by the small patch of garden in his backyard. It had been neglected for years, overgrown with weeds, the soil dry and cracked. He knelt down and ran his fingers through the earth. It felt rough, hardened by time and neglect, just like him. For years he had been caught in the relentless pace of life, too busy to tend to the things that truly mattered. But now he had time. Now he had patience, and so little by little he began to care for the garden. He cleared away the weeds, softened the soil, planted new seeds. He didn't rush the process. He simply showed up each day, tending to it with quiet devotion. At first nothing seemed to change, but slowly new life began to emerge. Green shoots pushed through the earth. Tiny buds formed on the branches. Flowers began to bloom where there had once been only neglect. And as the garden transformed, so did he. Silence was no longer something to be feared. It was no longer an empty void or a reminder of loneliness. It had become a companion, a teacher, a doorway into something deeper. He realized now that silence was not just a moment, it was a way of living. It was in the pauses between words, the quiet patience of a listening heart. It was in the stillness of a morning walk, the gentle way the world whispered its secrets when he took the time to hear them. It was in the space between thoughts, where clarity and peace could finally take root. One evening, as the sun dipped, below the horizon, John sat on his porch watching the golden light stretch across the garden. The air was filled with the soft hum of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind. He smiled. For the first time in his life, he was not waiting for the next thing. He was not lost in the past or anxious about the future. He was simply here. And in that simple presence, he had found everything he had been searching for. John sat on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair. The crisp autumn air wrapped around him, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and earth. The world before him was quiet, yet full of the rustling of trees, the distant chirping of crickets, the soft hush of the wind as it danced across the yard. He watched as golden leaves drifted from the branches above, spiraling gently to the ground. He used to see them as reminders of time slipping away, of things lost and never to return, but now he saw them for what they truly were, a part of the natural rhythm of life. Nothing was permanent, and nothing needed to be. He took a slow breath, letting the stillness settle deep within him. This was the same chair he had sat in months ago, feeling the crushing weight of silence, but this time the silence did not feel empty. It did not suffocate. It did not demand to be filled. It simply was. He smiled. For so much of his life he had believed that meaning came from movement, from doing, from achieving. That silence was a void to be avoided, a sign of loneliness or purposelessness. But now, he understood. Silence was not the absence of life. It was the space in which life could be fully experienced. He had spent years chasing a sense of purpose, believing it existed in the next goal, the next accomplishment, the next conversation. But all along it had been here, waiting for him in the quiet moments he had been too busy to notice. John thought about his grandchildren, about how different his time with them felt now. He thought about the garden he had brought back to life, the simple joy of feeling the earth in his hands, of watching something grow slowly day by day. He thought about the monk's words, the reminder that thoughts were just clouds passing through an endless sky. And he wondered how many others, like him, had spent their lives drowning in noise, afraid of what silence might reveal. When was the last time you truly listened to the quiet? Not the absence of sound, but the quiet beneath it, the steady rhythm of your breath, the weight of your own presence, the gentle pulse of the world around you. So many of us live in a constant rush, filling every space with words, with distractions, with the next thing. We rarely pause long enough to hear what silence has to offer, but when we do, we find something remarkable. Not emptiness, but clarity. Not loneliness, but connection. John had learned that silence was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. It was in the space between words, in the patience of listening, in the quiet moments where life reveals its deepest truths. So, today take a moment to sit in stillness. Step away from the noise, even just for a little while. Let your thoughts come and go like clouds across the sky. Feel the world around you, the simple rhythm of existence. And most of all, listen to the quiet, to yourself, to the life that is happening right here in this moment. Because sometimes the most profound wisdom is found not in what we say, but in what we choose to hear. If this story resonated with You take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts. Let's continue this journey together, embracing stillness, learning from silence, and finding peace in the spaces between.